Make me understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand you devil, so the light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand you devil, so the light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Make me understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand you devil, so your light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand you devil, so the light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Make me understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand you devil, so your light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me.
I find it's been best with the podcast lately to not even like if a bunch of people are already talking in a conversation, we just kind of get going and talk about whatever, and then we kind of like hit the questions as we like, or just not even hit any of them, or half of them, or all of them, or whatever we feel like is a good idea. So the questions that I sent were just like ideas that I was coming up with, like questions that I've always wanted to ask. But I'm sure Sean has like some of his own, and you all have some of your own, maybe for Sean or myself, etc. Things like that. So
sure,
yeah, sure.
We'll see where it goes. Yeah,
cool. Also, I've always wanted to ask. Well, Benjamin, so your music is on YouTube, and you have that little symbol next to your name. It's like a logic negation symbol, like the little line, and then like a horizontal line, and then
like this
little downward line.
The L on the side.
It's, I don't know, man. Like, you know how in regular music you just have like how do you call it? Like the one line? Yeah. So I figured because this is music from a different universe, it needs a different thing for that, you know?
Oh, okay. I get it. So it's kind of like, it's like you have like a line, like a staff line, and then it just goes into another dimension. That's kind of cool.
I mean, doesn't it look like some kind of like ancient scripture in a sense?
Yeah, just because of like
it's just an aesthetic, I guess, man.
Yeah, it's all about the aesthetic of matching the aesthetic of the music, I guess.
Yeah, that is really cool. Like the simplicity of it.
I guess I'm just edgy, man. I guess that's it.
Yeah, I think that's really neat. I tried to look that up, and like it was hard to look up on the internet, so it's a good job finding that. That's pretty cool.
I don't even remember like how to like at some point I just hit it and then I started to copy paste that thing because I don't remember how to induce it, you know?
Right. Exactly. Now I remember, I think the first thing I heard that you had written was something in 22 tone equal temperament. I think it was like the song was like mirrors of something. But yeah.
The Mirror.
Oh, that one's really good, yeah.
I love that one so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it was the second microtonal song I made, like a full song. I've been noodling around for a year before I actually put something out there, I guess. So yeah, that was the first one. Before that, I had something going on in 24.
Yeah.
And that was, I didn't know how to start, you know, I didn't even know what tuning to pick. So I just, in my mind, figured, okay, 24 seems logical. So, but then I don't know, it became like the project itself became a bit weird. And I was like, I don't know, I'm looking for something different. And then when I started hearing some stuff in 22 and I was like, this seems interesting. And then this was the first song that I just fully sat down, and when I started to find certain kinds of tonalities, I was freaked out because it was just a whole musical world sort of opening up.
And I think it's an interesting point about 24 as well, is that 24 looks like the easiest microtonal tuning to try, and I'd say out of all the ones I've tried, it is easily one of the hardest to actually use in a way that it feels natural.
Yes, yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Like, it's that paradox where you think, okay, so what's the easiest microtonal tuning? Quarter tones. It naturally extends what you already know. But because everything that you already know is there and all the quarter tones are so left of field, it can make it really, I don't know, I find it really difficult to compose with.
My problem with it was that it became a bit hard to go like really Zen harmonic with it, in a sense, because I found that every time I used like those in between notes, those quarter tones, I just wanted to go back to like the 12 tone side of it, you know?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't using it, you know, in a how do you say it, in a really proper way. Because you can go really, for example, you can induce a lot of quarter tone effects with it or go for those kinds of skills. But if you're, you know, making 12 tone music within 24, you're bound to just want to pull all the other notes back to 12, you know?
You know, if you're using something like 19, you can still write diatonic music that would sound just like it does in 12, but just a little bit different.
Yeah.
And that's fine because you have that different effect there. But with 24, when you get pulled back to those 12 tones, you're really just writing non-microtonal stuff again.
Exactly. And then if most of the stuff you're doing is 12 and then you want to jump out, it's going to be a bit weird, you know?
Yeah.
Because of like how it just hits your ear. You have that kind of strong 12-tone core and then you jump out to, you know, a more complex ratio and it just pops out in a weird way. So that's why, 24 is just difficult, man. I guess it depends on how you approach it.
Maybe it would be a lot more useful if 12 wasn't so familiar, then
Maybe,
24 would be a lot easier to use.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree with that. If society had decided that 19 was the best and everyone used 19, then 24 would have much more appeal, I think.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy to think about how arbitrary that is?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how you found 22, is you worked with 24 and you were like, okay, this isn't as easy as I'd been led to believe.
So I don't even quite remember how I got there exactly. I think it was just that 22 seemed to be a popular number, and I've heard some stuff in it. Certain kind of things sparked me because they were really, really out there in a tonal kind of way, and I was like, what's going on here? So then I think I just dove in and was like, oh, this is how I divide the octave, and let's try 22. So I think that's how it came to be. I can't quite remember what sparked it, what triggered it, but I felt like 22, it just did it for me at that point,
So had you been in contact with the microtonal community and like, as a result, they had recommended scales for you to use, or had you like just gone online and kind of looked that up yourself, or how did you think you were influenced to make that decision?
It's really vague for me how I got into it. It's just a weird kind of rush because now I'm fully like indulged in making microtonal music, but I don't quite remember how everything went. It was just I don't know. I think it's because I have a history of like enjoying Oriental music or music from the East, for Turkish intervals, that kind of stuff. So, but I never considered that like Xen harmonic or microtonal. It was just like an aspect of music for me. But then I started to discover these things on YouTube, for example, stuff that Sevish did, and I was like, whoa, that's way different than anything I've ever heard. And then I just started to dig around, mostly on YouTube, and I found all kinds of microtonal music, and from there, I guess I established a certain kind of overview of what tunings people gravitate towards, and then I just dove in, and most of it was experimentation and finding out like the tunings I like myself most, So I started like dividing the octave up and just puzzling around, and then at some point you reach those tunings that you prefer, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it helps when you hear a piece of music that you really like, and you hear some aspect of it that you go, wow.
Yeah.
The way those two notes interact at this one point, or this sound of this chord. Mm-hmm. As you're digging through all the different microtonal music there is on the internet. That's like kind of what inspires me, at least, to go, I really want to try that tuning, It has a particular sound to it that I really enjoy. I do not remember at all how I decided that 19 was where I would start, but I didn't really stick with it. I tried pretty much everything else that I could think of, and eventually settled on 17.
You made 19 sound really Xen harmonic, and there's this one song, I think, in Picometric that I think was like, wow, that's 19? It sounds so Xen. And I was just blown away.
Was it Deepest Reaches?
I don't remember which one it is.
How did it go for you, Stephen? Like, how did you get into microtonal music?
Well, I had always been interested, and then in 2015, two things happened. The first thing was I started listening to more microtonal music in general, and actually, of course, Sean was one of the first people that I had discovered on the internet, as well as like Elaine Walker, and then Aaron Hunt introduced me to the Facebook group, and the Facebook group I think was really important for me because it sort of brought all the esoteric theory to life, and like a bunch of people were talking about it, so I realized, I should probably kind of figure out how this works. So then Paul Ehrlich and I talked a lot, and then I started writing more and more on the computer. The very, very first thing I wrote actually was in 22 EDO as well, but then I sang that at my recital, and then I kept exploring other tunings, trying to unleash their inner character. And I just kept getting inspired by all the other microtonal music I was hearing too, like pretty much anything new that came out that was microtonal. 90% of the time I was like, oh, this is exciting. Sometimes it's not, but that's pretty rare. So, I mean, that's kind of my journey. And then, of course, I met Sean, and now we're doing this lovely podcast, and everything's awesome.
That's good.
Yeah. Those are always the fun things in music, you know, when you establish certain kind of things to do, you know. For example, in your case, it's then a podcast, but it might be streaming for someone else or whatever, but that always like gives a huge kind of boost to your musical journey, in a sense.
Yeah. So, Sean, how did you originally have the idea?
Is that what you want to know? Well, how I got started with microtones? Okay, yeah. So it's a bit hazy. Now, I remember I was in high school when I started reading about it. So I must have been aware of it since about 2006. That would have been when I was doing my exams for my final year of high school. And I remember there was a gamelan field trip that I missed because I turned up late and the bus had already left.
Oh, no!
That sucks.
I know, yeah, and I had to go to school like normal that day, and I thought I was going to London to see the gamelan. But then I think in the weeks or months that followed, I checked out some gamelan music and got into it, and I got into that before I got into microtones. But reading up on that, I became aware that there was this other aspect of the music, which was the tuning was different to the tuning that I had at that point had been taken for granted because I'd been learning about music from school. And so yeah, that was an entry point, but I can't remember exactly how that all came together. And I think it took me a couple of years until I started exploring this in my own work. It must have been about 2008 or 2009 when I did my first little experiments. And I think the first tuning that I tried to use was 15 Edo, and I really couldn't get it to work.
Really?
The reason why I chose 15, I'm guessing now, is because I was really into this album by Randy Winchester called 5 Hemispheres. And there's a song on that too, which I think we've discussed a few times on this podcast already. But track 2 on that album is in 15 Edo. And it just sounds so lovely.
Yeah.
And really otherworldly and almost kind of, well, I don't know. But it's just really nice. I can't put my finger on it.
I think it's interesting that it started for you with gamelan music, because I think I never really thought of microtonal music as weird, because in primary school we learned Indonesian, and part of learning Indonesian was learning Indonesian culture, and so we used to watch videos and stuff of gamelan. And we had in our classroom, they're like these bamboo tube things. I think they're called angklung.
Boomwhackers?
And you shake them, and they go. They're fantastic. You should Google them.
Yeah.
And so we used to play those, and they were all tuned to Pelog or something. They were all tuned to some really weird, super different tuning than anything else. Then I remember in music class we had a project to build a musical instrument, and so I decided to get bits of metal tubing and connect up little keys that would, when you push them down, would push against rubber bands and strike against the metal tubes with like a little metal tine thing. And because at the time I knew absolutely zero about music, my thought was, okay, so when I look at things with tubes on them, musical instruments with tubes on them, I like when they all differ by the same amount. So I cut each tube like an inch shorter than the next, and I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that makes a subharmonic series. So I think that's right. So the first musical instrument I ever actually made was some subharmonic series thing. So for me, I never actually thought of microtonal music as weird. I think Dolores Catherino was the first person where I actually realized that the kinds of notes that I wanted to be using, you'd have to use special techniques to actually access them. But yeah, no, it's just interesting. Everyone's different journey to reach there.
I never viewed microtonal music as weird either, like that never crossed my mind. It's more sometimes certain intervals or harmonies, they just are way out there, and then I consider something either weird or to have a way out there kind of experience, in a sense. Wondering
what you think Xen harmonic weirdness should do in your music. And of course, anyone feeling free to chime in on this question, or what kind of role that you think that weirdness should have in your music.
I guess it comes down to what, why do I even make this kind of music? And it might be because I was looking for certain kinds of detunes that you can either achieve by like detuning synths and get certain bends or warps going that give a really deep kind of spiritual effect, to me at least. Or you could change the tuning and find those intervals that cause that, For example, there's electronic music or dance music where certain producers, they curve like something, a sustained kind of tonal thing. They curve it on top of normal harmony, and then you're like, whoa, that detune like hits my brain so in such a weird way, right?
Yeah.
And it gives us it sometimes even gives a deep primal effect to it. But you can view that from the perspective, okay, I'm detuning like 12 tone, or you can dive into why it still sounds harmonious and find out it might be in harmonic 7th that you're bending to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I think I make microtonal music, or at least try to implement, Xen harmonic aspects into it, because I feel like it's just a hidden kind of jungle that I want to dive into, There are mysteries there, and I just want to see what happens when you dive in.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you take those ideas and you try to sort of create new music theory, right? You can be tonal, but still be outside of the familiar tonal space. You can use new dissonances to resolve to new consonances. And if you pay attention to sort of where all the notes are going, you can have it happen in a way that feels familiar, but lands in a very unfamiliar place, which, in terms of music, like it's well known about music that if you can sort of throw the listeners and give them something that they don't expect, then it can make the music really exciting. And so it makes sense that you can just extend common practice music. At least that's how I like to do it. Use new chord progressions and things to make confuse the listener and make them go, whoa, what happened there? I'll have to go back and re-listen to it. That was interesting.
I'm trying to. Do you, Sevish? Do you remember that track, "Dirty Drummer"? I guess you called it.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right. So there, I think that in particular, a moment there, like something you do with the voices. There, you have, I think, a voice chord that goes through that you also like bend in the small step of 22 Edo, I think. Do you remember that? Like that voice that goes through it?
I don't remember any bending in that, like a pitch bending kind of thing.
I think you have like 2 chords, so with the voices, and they shift in a small step. So that would be in 22. That would be 45 cents, I think.
Yeah, 50, 55?
Yeah, 55.54.
Oh, yeah, my bad.
54.5454.
54.5454.
Oh, no.
So why I'm referring to that specific moment is because that is for me, that's the kind of stuff that sparks me. The way the notes there themselves are already like way out there, but they somehow work. So it's a harmonic experience to me, but it's so you can't find that by being in regular kinds of tunings. And so it's even really hard to achieve that kind of stuff with bending like regular synths, to achieve that specific kind of tonal experience. That is something like deeply engraved in 22 specifically, or for that matter in certain kinds of Edos, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why, at some point it felt natural to just expand tunings and find out like where the magic is. I didn't want to stick to the color that 12 tone provided,
Yeah.
Because don't get me wrong, 12 tone is a solid tuning, and most of the music I listen to is in 12 tone, but you cannot take away the color it has,
Yeah.
You cannot change the color. It's already been, fully put out there.
Well, and there are plenty of techniques that you can use. Like recently I've been playing with 34 equal temperament and pumping the syntonic comma. So I've got a chord progression that pumps the syntonic comma up, and then a chord progression that pumps it back down. So the root is constantly moving up and down. It's something that, you can implement as like a feature of the music, and it can become really interesting.
Yeah, is that what you were talking about in your in microtonal funk? Because I think you were talking about a song where you drifted up to a note 2 out of 17 or 2 degrees of 17 EDO higher, but then back down, and you used the different neutral thirds in it. But maybe I'm getting mixed up.
Yeah. No, I think I did a similar thing there, but I don't remember. I may have. I don't know. There are some very interesting comma pumps you can do in 17, but they're all quite complicated, use harmonics that aren't very familiar, and so they don't really end up sounding like comma pumps. They end up just sounding like you're just doing a weird chord progression. But yeah, no, I think there was something like that. I would have to go back and look.
Yeah. Sean, there's a song that you wrote that was in like Blackwood 10 that I thought was in JI when I heard it. And it just like blew me away that the chords would sound so good.
Blackwood 10. Yeah. So songs that I've written in Blackwood 10 are So Thankful.
I'm so thankful. I bet that's it. Is that one that goes...
Yeah.
It's that one.
How did you get the voice going for that? Actually, you know, the descending kind of. I think it's a voice, right? The descending.
The vocoder.
Yeah. Like
yeah.
What do you have on that mixer? That specific mixer channel. Like what's going on there? Do you remember?
So I don't remember exactly. There will be a vocoder. So some synth playing the chords that play in the same thing as the electric piano is playing.
Yeah.
And then I'm whispering into the microphone the lyrics. Because I felt like whispering kind of got a better sound. The outcome was better, I guess, because all of the higher noisy elements.
I think because whispering is so noisy, yeah, it works well with the vocoder.
Yeah, so I whispered all of the vocals. I mean, if you hear them without the vocoder, it's so bad. When I whisper, there's kind of like this resonant thing in my voice that I had to really notch out. So that's another thing that would have been on there. I notched that out before it went into the vocoder. And
right.
I can't remember what else would be on there, actually.
I love
That's
that
fantastic.
song, man. It's very even
Thank
like
you.
the production side of it. So not only the tuning side, but like the way it's produced and the way the sound sits. It's so clean and pleasant to listen to. As you can crank it up way loud and it just sits nice on your speakers or headset. You know.
That's cool. I had a lot of problem with the mixing on that one. So everything was extremely dark. Like the whole sound of it was tonally very dark.
Yeah.
So I had to use some kind of exciters kind of things to introduce some more stuff in there.
Is that how you generally like go for a solution in a production, or do you sometimes start to shift octaves to see if you can brighten it up in that fashion?
I do while I'm working, listen out for these things and continually change them as I'm going along. But in this case, I felt like all of the material was where it needed to be. It was just that the mix was dark for whatever reason. And on its own, if you listen to it, I guess it's fine. But in the context of the whole album, compared to other tracks that were on the album that sounded a lot brighter, there needed to be some kind of compromise.
Oh, yeah.
So I did add some kind of... and it was the only track on the album that I did this, where I added some kind of excitement or kind of air kind of thing to it, just to brighten the sound a bit. So, but I'm pleased that you think, you can turn it up loud and it kind of sits well, because I agonized over the mix on that one.
Yeah. For me, that's always like one of the measurement tools for how, how well produced I find something. It's just like how loud can I put it without it going into an unbalanced kind of stage, So with this track, it's just like a warm kind of cushion over your ears, And that's why I wouldn't be able to listen to the whole productions, in that whole phase to the brightness. So I produce a bit too warm most of the times.
That's interesting.
So do you have that too, or do you generally feel like your balance is already there and then the mastering is just an enhancement? Or do you feel like you need to compensate for either too much brightness or too much... how would you put it? Warmness, like muffledness? I don't know.
Right. I find that every single track that I mix does come out a bit differently. There are always different things that I need to apply to make them work together as a group. And I don't work in terms of singles or anything like that. I'm always working in terms of album. Each track is for an album. And if the track's not good enough, then I just don't bother finishing it because I want to finish the album. So yeah, I always find that the tracks when I'm done with them and I feel like they work individually, and then I want to sequence them and kind of feel them together as an album, that there are big kind of tonal differences. Again, when I use the word tonal, I'm not talking about like music theory tonal or microtonal. I'm talking about just the balance of the low pitches and the high pitches, just the overall brightness or warmness of it.
Right.
Do you enjoy that process, like those final stages of making an album where you have to decide like the orders and you have to decide like the overall feel and do you enjoy that process, and how do you approach that?
So yeah, that is one of the most exciting parts of the album, because that's when you can taste the thing being finished.
Yeah.
Like it takes a lot of work to go from random sketches to an album that you could potentially listen to from the beginning to the end. And when that work starts to pay off and you get a feel for the larger scale of things, the sequencing in particular, sometimes I have ideas as I'm working on the album. For example, there might be, I've got 5 tracks that I'm working on, and I know that one of them works really well leading into the next.
Yeah.
And then the other tracks, I don't really care about the order yet. But while I'm working on them, I know that, okay, these two kind of feel like a pair.
Yeah.
There's kind of a journey, or almost like this abstract narrative between them.
Yeah.
So those, I would try and maintain that within the sequencing when I come to sequence later on.
So do microtones affect how you get the flow of your album going? Like, would you say that, like, if you've got one track that ends with something that's not very Zen, then would you want to start the next track with something really Zen to, like, keep it fresh? Something that's Zen to you? Like, how does that weigh in?
Yeah, I think that is a factor, but the way I approach that isn't so much thinking of the tunings themselves, but just the impressions that I'm getting when I hear them. So I can feel when something is right, and the microtones are certainly affecting that. I might want to have a Xen harmonic track after one that's, microtonal but not Xen harmonic. For example, if I'm writing diatonic music in a tuning like 19 or 31 Edo, I might want to follow that up with something really Xen harmonic.
Yeah.
But I'm not thinking in terms of tunings. I'm thinking purely in terms of this impression that I get from hearing.
I guess that's most important, like the way some stuff follows each other up. Because I was talking to Declan earlier. I was listening to something regular in 12 tone, just, I don't know, chilling and listening to, I think it was drum and bass with some simple minor progressions. And then I jumped to like a Xen harmonic track. I guess it was something I was working on, and I went straight to the middle section of that, so into like the deepness of the Xen harmonicness. And I was like, whoa, my brain needs to adjust to this, like sometimes it's the switching can be either off or it can be brilliant, so I think especially when you're making an album with a bunch of different tunings and going back and forth, you sort of have to find that flow of where, like, how stuff remains harmonious to the brain, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Especially over like an extended period of time where things sort of change from being focused on the short term to being focused on the long term, and you've got to kind of like reinvent ways to like capture people's attention based on who your audience is and all of that.
Do you guys ever have like when you work on something microtonal or completely Xen harmonic, that when you return later you're not in the same perception anymore? So it's either like really difficult to get back into, or you can adjust rather quickly and you're back into that same experience you were in. Like how does it affect you? How does coming back to something that's old affect your do you still have that muscle memory going on, or do you sometimes feel like I just don't like this tuning anymore?
I can't think of anything specific, but I feel like sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I think like sometimes it's really easy to jump back in and I remember exactly where I was and what everything meant and how I felt, and then that comes back. And then sometimes, and generally when I don't get that, it's because I hate it. I come back and I'm like, this isn't working, that isn't working, this bit's too loud, the drums suck. It's hard when that happens.
Sometimes it's rather difficult to be a dedicated musician, because You can over criticize yourself, I think.
Well, it's something I've found with my 17-tone guitar recently. So I recorded the whole album in a reasonably short period of time.
Yeah.
With the guitar after I got it. And then I put it down for a bit and I was like, I want to take a break. I'm exhausted. I went back to playing the 12-tone guitar for a bit and took a couple of weeks just to have a breather. And I went back recently in the last few days to start playing the 17-tone guitar again. And it sounded really weird to me because I hadn't been listening to it. So suddenly I'm playing, like familiar like scale shapes and like playing sub-minor chords, which previously while making the album had sounded super familiar to me, not weird at all. And then playing them again, suddenly I was like, nah, the minor third's too flat. There's something wrong with that. And the major second, it's too sharp. There's something weird going on here. And it only took about an hour of playing to like get back in that headspace and feel really familiar with it again. But I think it gives you like a perspective then of, this is what someone who's never heard it before might like. This is closer to what they might be hearing. Because it's very easy when you work with a particular tuning a lot to become so familiar with it that it's not very Xen anymore.
Yeah.
Like there's only so many times you can play the 13th harmonic before it doesn't sound weird anymore. It just sounds like, oh, that's the 13th harmonic. But to everyone else, they go, okay, that sounds really out of tune. And I go, no, it's perfectly in tune. It's a perfectly tuned 13th harmonic. You know what I mean?
That's why it's so important for, at least for when you're making an album, just sometimes leave something alone for, and work on a bunch of other tracks and then return, because you gain perspective. And that is something, most of the time I don't have that with singles I put out there. I just make them, I'm in that zone where I'm just grinding it out, and then I finish it, and I'm most of the times at that point where I'm sick of it anyway, so I just put it out there, it's done. And then only half a year later I look back at it and can say to myself, oh, I like this or I don't like it, because the tonality hits in a different way. And that's why I sometimes wish I would still have that perspective where I never heard a microtone before,
It's interesting how like you can sort of force like a vacation from microtones on yourself, like whenever you want to, because it's not that pervasive in society, and so you can kind of like decide that for yourself and then use it to evaluate your own music. I think lately I've gotten better at like sort of switching my brain's headspace and like being able to kind of imagine that I'm still stuck in 12 EDO and like what music would sound like to me if I was in that state. Like I haven't been able to do that until really like 2019. When I would compose in 15 EDO, I would leave and come back and it would sound really, really Xen at first, and then after like going over that initial hurdle, I would just be like, oh, we're back. I get this.
Yeah, 15's one of those interesting ones. I think 15 for me, I hated for a really long time. It was my least favorite. I thought it was awful.
Oh, sad face.
No. I was convinced, because I had heard plenty of stuff in Blackwood 10 and I'd heard some of the stuff you'd done, and I thought there's gotta be, it's gotta be something that you learn to like. And so I kept making stuff with it because I thought there's something about this I haven't understood yet. And then one day it just clicked and suddenly I was like, oh my god, I actually love the sound of it. And then I went back and listened to everything I'd heard in 15 and suddenly I really enjoyed it. So I think it's one of those things that it's so unfamiliar that you almost have to learn to stop expecting it to sound familiar, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Is it that wide perfect fifth that does that for you?
It's that and the major seconds.
Yeah.
The two major seconds, neither of which are a major second.
Yes, exactly.
It's also this is a kind of an interesting field where we're diving into now. It's how does your brain react to tunings, and why can your brain morph so much to start to like something or dislike something? And a big part of it, of course, is conditioning. So if I listen to a lot of 12, and go to 17, first, for example, 17 didn't sit right with me. I just skipped it for a whole year. I went to 22, I went to 31, 34, that kind of stuff. In 19, Same. I tried
34. You've defected.
Yeah. So yeah, that's true. But but 34 has some more common ground. So that's why you might go for that. But 17, for example, the super major third, right? you can, in the beginning, if you're not used to it, it will constantly sound like a way sharp major third.
Yeah.
But at some point, you can start to experience the gravity from above, so there's an interval, trying to pull it up. And when you start to perceive that, then suddenly, it's actually more harmonious than my brain previously thought.
Like 9 on 7 or 14 on 11 or something.
Yeah, so you feel that, you start to feel that pull more. And that's how it always goes for me with tunings, so why I start to like something or why I dislike something. So let's say if I work a lot in 31 and I'm working a lot with the neutrals, then some other kind of, equal temperaments might start to sound good to me because I've been adjusted to certain gravities from the overtone series, You
have to learn to make your expectations more granular, I think. Mm-hmm. So, like when you first start making microtonal music, or at least when I first started, everything in my brain was trying to lock to how close is it to what 12 equal approximates. Do you know what I mean? So if I heard a sub minor third, my brain would be trying to lock that to 6 on 5 because everything I'd heard was either 12 equal or, mean tone was like one of the first things I'd found out about. So everything was trying to lock upwards, and then you learn to sort of make your perception more granular and go, is there something closer that my brain can lock it to? And suddenly if you're locking a sub minor third to 7 on 6 or whatever, it becomes a whole lot more consonant because you're not trying to perceive it as a really out of tune interval. You're suddenly perceiving it as a much more in tune interval that you're not familiar with as you become more familiar with it.
And then the way I approach like making microtonal music in that sense, I don't want stuff to sound out of tune. So I look for those in-between places where I actually feel like it's a thing of its own.
Yeah.
So when I started to make microtonal music, and when I got triggered enough to actually go for it, it was because I've heard stuff that I wasn't familiar with it, but it felt right, That I was referring earlier to, for example, that voice in the track from Sevish, the dirty drummer track. That was a thing of its own. It felt really like I've never heard that before, but it just clicked. It was like a detune that was very correct to my ear. And that's what I'm looking for in making microtonal sounds. I'm not looking for...
It's a correct type of wrongness.
Yeah, you can put it like that. And I think one of the persons who started developing that earlier was, for example, FX Twin. I don't know if I'm saying his name right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's done that a lot, where he makes his own kinds of detunes, but it reaches that point where it clicks as a tuning, and then you feel overwhelmed by the sensation of the detune. So you feel like it's not implying those 12 notes anymore. It's implying its own thing, right?
Yeah, I don't think Aphex Twin, as far as I understand, is particularly systematic about the way he detunes. He just detunes until it sounds good, which I think is a perfectly valid way of doing it. But it obviously would make it very difficult to analyze what he did and try to replicate that. It's much easier if you see that something you like was done in 15 equal temperament. You go, well, the easiest way to replicate that is to just load up the synthesizer with 15 equal temperament and play around on it until it sounds good.
Yeah, when I listened to his music a long time ago, back when I was naive to microtones, I didn't even realise there was anything odd about the tuning of his sounds. I was just kind of lost in the detail of his whole sound world, I guess, is a kind of identity of sound.
Yeah.
And that was just one part of it. So I expect that a lot of listeners, maybe hearing you guys' music, maybe hearing my music, thinking the same thing, not really... Maybe some of them are not aware of the microtonal aspect, but it does have an effect.
Well, I mean, that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? I think it definitely happens with yours. You were one of the first microtonal artists I stumbled across, and it's interesting how you can have something that sounds very different and unfamiliar, but not out of tune because it feels systematic. Like everything feels in tune with itself. And so I guess like we were mentioning earlier, Blackwood 10 is an example of a scale where it really holds together. So even though everything is totally unfamiliar, it all feels systematic. So it's very easy to understand what's going on, even if the way that things connect together is totally unfamiliar.
I think that's a big reason why sometimes stuff looks really good on paper, but just doesn't function well to the ear, and the other way around. It's because of how everything like interconnects with each other. So you might have, beautiful intervals that are all in tune, but if they don't relate well to each other on a deeper kind of level, it just doesn't feel right,
Yeah. Well, I had that, here I'm going to upset a whole lot of people.
Go on, let's go.
But very, like, early on in exploring microtonal tunings, I got quite interested in just intonation and played a lot with just intonation. And, I really enjoyed it. And I think I made some things that were pretty interesting. Not necessarily any good, but just intonation it sits in this place where it can very quickly become unsystematic if you're not careful, and you can end up having a whole lot of notes doing a whole lot of different things, and it can be very difficult to keep track of. And so when I said I would upset a lot of people, I'm not saying anything against just intonation. A lot of people use it fantastically, but I'm saying I have trouble using it because I like to have everything just locked. That's why equal temperament is so fantastic for me, is because yes, everything's more out of tune, but it's so easy to keep track of where everything is and all the resources that you have available that it makes writing music very natural for me.
Like after a while of working with it and starting to understand it more, it lost a bit of its magical touch. I think for the same reasons you're calling it out for.
I'm not calling it out
because even you're calling it out. No, I'm messing with you. For example, like I didn't realize that if you have a fundamental and you stack a bunch of intervals on it, so you basically create a chord. If they're all in tune with the root or fundamental, there might start to in between they might start to have like more complicated relations, causing them to be out of tune in a sense. Sometimes when I was working with like more complicated just intonation kind of stuff, I started to feel like, why doesn't it feel right to me? Even though they're all supposed to be perfect, but it just didn't. There was some kind of clash going on that I couldn't pinpoint, and it might be because of those deeper relationships or how they hold up against how the intervals hold up against each other. So not only how they react to the fundamental,
Huh.
Yeah.
Is this something you only experienced when you had a lot of notes in a chord?
I guess. Because simple chords, most of the time they work. Because a JI, for example, major triad, it's very clear on what the relationships are in the chord. But if you extend it, you might get a lot of more complicated relationships, I guess.
Yeah, and the thing is, as you get more notes that form more complex relationships, there are always going to be simple relationships that are nearby those complex ones, like in the case of wolves. And so even though everything locks nicely to just intonation, you still get beating and stuff. And so oftentimes you then end up with chords that, even if they were tempered, wouldn't necessarily sound worse than the just intonation versions.
Exactly, yeah.
The way I view just intonation is it's not fundamentally different to temperament. They're just on a sliding scale of which notes you have. And in the case of wolves in just intonation, I just view them as they're just untempered approximations of multiple different intervals.
So sometimes the clarity of, like, especially if you use just intonation for harmony, the clarity of it sometimes bothers me a bit. I can't pinpoint why.
Yeah, me too.
It just, I don't know. It feels like a void sometimes, or it feels a bit soulless.
A void, yeah. For me, it sounds kind of indistinct. Like I can't really pick out what's happening, and I find it less so with acoustic music, but more so with electronic music, particularly stuff that we do digital, where everything's so well tuned and locked down to some sample rate. The extreme lack of beating just kind of fuses things too much, whereas I want things to be a little bit more distinct.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you're...
Yeah.
Well, on acoustic instruments, I think just intonation makes a lot more sense, because you still have beating, because very few instruments have perfectly harmonic overtones. Some do, but even then, they're not going to intonate perfectly. You're going to have just intonation warbling by at least a part of ascend. Usually, like on guitar, I'm not particularly fussy. I'm happy to have it within 5 cents. You know, I remember I was discussing a paper about barbershop quartets, and barbershop quartets. Is there a way that you can link that? I can give you the link, and you can put that in the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, it's a really interesting paper about the fact that they tend to tune. Like they tend to sing the major thirds quite sharp. Yes. And a lot of the time they tend to sing them as closer to Pythagorean major thirds of I don't know if they're tuning them Pythagorean intentionally, but they tend to be sharper than 400 cents rather than that's in I think it was in dominant chords. They tend to do that. No, in the root chord. In dominant chords they're closer, but in the root chord they tend to sing the major third quite sharp.
Is there a specific reason for that? Like, is it useful to do that, or
the reasoning was that I don't know exactly why, but the fact is it doesn't sound bad because there's no beating, because in barbershop and in all styles of singing, everyone's voices are warbling slightly, and so the slight change in pitch of their voice over time means that you never get a consistent beating. And so it never actually sounds bad, even though it's not locked into just intonation at all.
Yeah.
So, they would sing... the paper was looking at warm-ups, and Paul Ehrlich was telling me that it probably wasn't representative of real life. But the point still stands that in practice there's a lot of room for error, but there's also, on practical, like physical acoustic instruments, just intonation is... I think a lot less unnatural sounding.
Yeah, what I find, like, just intonation for me is something I want there. I want it to be there when I need it. That's how I view it. So that's why I look for strong tunings that still have a little bit of clash here and there, so that you can still get that nice electronic bass if needed, or that kind of thick sound because of the slight beatings everywhere. But sometimes you just want to pinpoint that interval. For example, the harmonic seventh, I just love it when it's really like close to its true nature, Yeah. But if you use that seventh, that perfect seventh in the context of everything around it being perfect, it loses that essence. What are you doing? A harmonic seventh?
I'm trying, but it's so early that I'm just bad at it.
Oh, yeah, that sounds right.
That's a little bit flat, I think.
That sounds right.
I think that's the right idea. I don't know. Like, JI is so weird. I almost feel like you're prone to sharpness or flatness depending on your vowel, and changing your vowel, like, changes the perceived pitch entirely. So it wouldn't surprise me that barbershop singers are overshooting a major third. I've often thought that super Pythagorean major thirds actually sound more like the 12-tone major third than just major thirds. Just they've got, I think, a similar overall character, where they just they have a little bit of rub, but they sit in a place that the just minor third doesn't. Like, when I first played the 17-tone major third, the 17-tone, like, 420 cent third or whatever, like, I always thought that sounded more like a 12 EDO major third than the just major third did when I was comparing them. It's weird.
No, I have to agree. To me, it sounds more out of tune, but it actually does sound more familiar than a 5-on-4, weirdly. Yeah. But then again, now playing with the 17-tone guitar, I've become so familiar with its major thirds that they sound just as consonant to me. Yeah, no, they sound very consonant to me. But anyone I play them for thinks that it sounds like a terribly out of tune major chord. So
I started to appreciate the major third of 12 more after I dove deep into microtonality.
Nice.
No, it's I don't know. It's just I guess it's because I started to realize there are more pulls. It's not just that 5-4 pulling. There's more pulling, and if you start to realize that, then your mind just opens up to a different kind of experience. So that's why 12 can sound very zen when you come back to it, because you're not dealing with those completely simple ratios. There, you still have those deviations that cause like different kinds of pulls from the harmonic series. So when you're in 17 and you experience all these different kinds of different kinds of elements and strong consonances or dissonances, and you go back to 12, it suddenly becomes a whole fresh kind of experience. And it actually takes a bit of time before you get back to that common experience of like, oh, I'm listening to regular music, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas if I make like clear harmonic music in 31, I don't have that effect as much. You know, when I work in 17 and 22 and return to 31, because they are more locked into those simple ratios, I don't get that Xen experience. It just feels like sort of between quotes correct music, you know?
31 does.
Yeah, it feels really like completely regular to me. It doesn't matter how far I deviate from 31 if I go back to it and stay in those kind of simple. So I'm not talking about like the neutral and the super major and the sub minor, but if I'm talking about the core of the tuning, that always will feel natural to me.
Yeah, me too.
Well, the fact that it's pretty much quarter comma mean tone, I think really helps that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure, it has its own kind of aura, but the aura is more, as we were talking about, it tends to lean towards that void aspect of JI more, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why it never feels weird to me. It just feels like a kind of locked in kind of feel, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like the to my ear, it feels like the best compromise between, in mean tone tuning, diatonic scales with a leading tone that's too flat, and diatonic scales where the major chord is a bit out of tune. Like, it sits right on that nice point where neither one is really too bad. But of course there's 31 notes, so that's a lot.
Yeah, but it's not as many as the next best compromises, is it? I like 55, but I've never been able to do anything with it because it bothers me that I can't use the whole thing, and I refuse to use the whole thing.
This is a really interesting concept. The idea that if you have a tuning, you're expected to use most, if not all of the notes. And I don't know if this is apropos to bring up or if you'd be interested, but this is like a major theme on my upcoming electronic album, which is all about deconstructing notions of why we use tuning and what makes a tuning used and stuff. Like, I have a 21-minute long track in 0 EDO.
Is 0 one note, or is it no notes, or is it infinite notes?
It's just one snare repeating, man, on 120 BPM.
Don't spoil it. 0 EDO is one note that has any reference pitch, and then all other notes are undefined, because that's what happens when you divide by 0. So yes, I only use that one note. So, I don't attempt to use any undefined value in a clever way. Maybe that's for part 2, but like...
That's a bizarre idea. I like it.
You know, it's so funny, because on Facebook, everyone's joking about, like, the end game of tuning. And so I was trying to, like, defeat that again and again. So the first track is in 1200 EDO. So what's going to top that? But then we've got all these other tracks in various smaller EDOs, some of them even subsets. So it kind of...
What about 2400 EDO?
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, don't worry. There's a track later that has all of the EDOs that are on Joe Manzo's page that are absolutely giant.
There's a point where they become impractical.
Well, see, that's the thing.
Sure.
That's the thing on this album. I'm like, if it's impractical, damn it. And also that I don't have to use the full tuning.
At this point, do you guys like still pay attention to if, you know, the microtonal music you make at some point, do you value it becoming practical? So do you have like a line where you say, okay, no, not higher than this temperament? Or is that completely faded? You know, like, did you throw that out the window?
I did. I threw it out the window just for this album because I wanted this album to be insane. But usually I like to have a number of notes that I like to keep track of. But this is a really special album where I'm trying to get rid of all my intuition. There's also like other tracks with tons of different tunings in them that are polysystemic and unusual. Like one track that you'll hear on Jude Thomas's radio show is all equal divisions of the tritave from 5 to 50 in one track. So that's kind of what this album is doing. It's packing a real punch. It was really, really hard to make. And another one that I'm not done with yet is all 11-note MOSs with periods of 2 and the higher Feigenbaum constant, where L divided by S equals 2 phi.
Damn, yo, you gotta save some notes for us, man. Like, chill. You know, we're trying to make some new music here, man. Chill.
That does bring up an interesting point, and it's great that Sean's leaving because now I'm going to talk about him.
Yay!
He's used 313 tone equal temperament quite a bit.
Oh yeah, with the Island 9 scale.
for Semaphore or Madagascar or whatever the tuning's called.
I think it's got to be Madagascar.
The one that's a stack of...
Semaphore's not...
the one that's a stack of...
Yeah, it's a stack of something.
250 cents or
13,
whatever.
13 over 10 is tempered to something nice, and then it counts as like an island scale instead of semaphore.
Yeah, the island scales are... they're interesting. I looked into them a bit. Anyway, that's not the point. My point was, when I first saw that, I had a look because he listed it in the description what the tuning was, and I looked at it and I was like, so he's using 313 to get this scale. It looks like it's pretty much just 24 equal temperament, or 19. Like, you can pretty much do the scale in those and it will sound pretty close. The first thing I thought was that, when I looked at it, was that, you can basically do it in 24, why bother using something bigger? And then I had to think about it and thought, well, you're using a subset, so there's not really any largest, there's not any largest equal temperament. There's no such thing as an impractically large one.
Right.
Because there's always going to be some optimal one, and it doesn't matter how huge it is, that tempers just the right commas and gets you to just the right spot, where it's just slightly nicer than some smaller version.
The aura of that subset, so it's 313 equal temperament, right?
Yeah.
That aura, I've never heard any other tuning give that sensation, that aura.
We're talking about Desert Rain, of course.
Yeah. It's the aura. It's just the aura. So even though as you talked about, you can like emulate it in 19 or 24. Even though the deviations might be super small, this has such a specific kind of feel that you will not achieve.
It's very easy to like look at really high ones, and I was actually doing this earlier, so I'm picking on myself here. It's very easy to look at something like 1200 equal divisions of the octave and say, well, that's impractically large. But if you're using a subset of it, then there's no reason why you can't go as high as you want.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And I know I've like heard comments from people saying, that's really big, why would you bother using something so big? Just use a smaller amount of notes. But
it's all conceptual, isn't it? It doesn't have to do with how they perceive it. They just know that you're using a big tuning.
It's all theoretical stuff that's going on behind the scenes. None of it actually has to influence the way that you write the music in the end. And that's like a big part of how I approach writing microtonal music, is I'll immerse myself in how a tuning works. I'll say what chords are available, what commas does it temper and stuff. And then I'll write it all by ear. And I won't pay attention to commas, and I won't pay attention to what just intonation intervals the chords approximate or anything.
Yeah.
But the fact that I bothered paying attention to what functions those might have before I actually dived into the tuning means that, I have an understanding of what resources I'll be using so that I can pick myself out of a rut or whatever if I happen to get stuck. And I can go back and analyze it later and say, why did this work?
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of like, in terms of theory versus just feeling it out by ear when you're making music, for me, there's a certain kind of balance. It's mostly just by ear, but I do consciously pay attention to certain concepts, like where do I give the home chord, how much fifths are in my progressions, because those are just, for me, general rules that just make the overall experience way better. So if I'm in a complicated kind of microtonal situation where I have like intricate harmonies and I want to make sure that people catch on to that, I just start to look for the fifths, and maybe I add a couple fifths in there, like the voice leading having enough fifths and fourths, and then the, internally in the chords have a lot of fifth motion going on and that kind of stuff. Those are just general rules for me when I'm building, But besides that, I'm not gonna be overthinking certain choices, because it's just, I make music instinctively. So when I'm building a progression, most of the time I hear where I want to go. I hear, I want to go to that chord, and I might not even know what that chord is, but I can hear it sort of emerging from the situation, and I'm trying to find what I'm hearing.
Ultimately, it's about, does it sound good, right?
I could relate to that completely.
Like, you could make a tuning using, that's intentionally the worst approximation of just intonation ever.
18 EDO.
And if it sounds good, it sounds good. It doesn't,
18 EDO.
Oh, yeah.
Once JI becomes really ingrained in your head as a microtonalist, don't things that really, really get away from JI sound way more Xen harmonic in general because they're just not expected? I mean, that's sort of how I think about a lot of EDOs that like have little to do with JI and how exciting they can be.
And there's something really nice about stacking a sub-minor third on top of a major third.
Yeah.
Where it sounds nice even though it doesn't add up to a fifth.
Yeah.
So on paper it looks like it shouldn't sound nice, but you've got two really nice sounding, like, okay, the major third is very familiar and the sub-minor third is very close to JI, and you stack them on top of each other and it's got a really nice sound. I think that's what drew me originally to 13 equal temperament. That's why I've used it quite a bit, because it's something that is inherently like it misbehaves, if that makes any sense. Anything you want it to do, it tends to not want to make work. It's very slippery, and so when you can get something out of it that sounds good, it's so satisfying.
Is there any like particular thing a tuning needs to have for you guys in order for you to work with it, or not? For example, for me it's a fifth. Like if a fifth gets too bad, I'm not gonna touch the tuning. You know, it might even function in a lot of nice ways, but it's just something I can't deal with. It doesn't appeal to me. It's maybe too Zen. Maybe that's it. You know, I tend to lean towards 12-tone harmony with extensions. I guess that's it, man. So if something doesn't have, you know, if a tuning doesn't have a good fifth, I just don't touch it. Maybe that's a bias, or maybe that's dumb to do. Maybe I can discover a lot of nice things if I let that go, you know, but I don't know. But is there something, you know, you guys are that a tuning needs to have in order for you to work with it, or don't you guys mind that, you know?
If a tuning has a good fifth, I am way more likely to use it.
Okay.
In the past, I've used tunings that had really bad fifths.
Yeah.
And all kinds of other stuff. And sometimes I've used like production techniques to get around that, and sometimes I haven't. And various, you know, sometimes it turns out well and sometimes it doesn't, you know. Sometimes my music's really poorly executed. But, a fifth's quite important, I think. So I totally agree with you there.
What kind of production techniques do you use to get around things like, well, bad fifths, or wolf fifths, maybe even?
Well, I try not to use production techniques to get around things that sound bad, because the idea is that you start with something that sounds good and you use production techniques to make them even better, right?
Yeah. I knew I was doing this wrong.
For, say, 23 Edo, I have used that one a couple of times in the past, and for one track in particular, I think we discussed this on the Brendan Burns episode.
Yes.
And it was Twisted Flax that I wrote. Whatever synth patch is playing the chords in that, it's actually like a fifths patch. So when you press a note, you hear the note and a little bit of the fifth above it. But that's a purely tuned fifth. So I'm using 23 to kind of navigate around this tonal space. But there's another kind of 23 Edo that's overlapping, interlocking that one, that's separated by a fifth. That's the way you can think of it. So that's one thing you can do.
This reminds me of these discussions that we always have about Boll and Pierce, where like, is it illegal to include octaves in our timbre? And like we have this whole thing where like in microtonality that we just don't have in 12-tone equal temperament. Like, you know, there's lots of people playing 12-tone equal temperament who just like couldn't give a damn about whether the 13th harmonic shows up in whatever notes they're playing, as long as it sounds cool. And I think that's a great way to use 23 and any tuning with a bad fifth and really kind of like get around that. This is also something Ben Spees and I were talking about.
I remember the episode where you talked about that with Bell and Pierce, and it was such a relief for me when I heard you guys sort of agree that it's fine to use octaves if they sound good. And I was like, thank goodness, because at the time I was writing something where the bass was an octave lower, because a tritive lower to me just it doesn't. It's just totally different. But I never ended up releasing that for other reasons. It just didn't technically come out good. But
I made one track in Boll and Pierce. The reason I did it is the tuning was way too weird for me. Even though I hear sick shit in the tuning, I'm just not triggered enough to like actually dive in. But I just wanted to make one. But I didn't even know about that whole situation where you don't have, you know, the way the octave works and stuff. When I was working on it, I just made a progression, and then when I wanted the bass line, I just had like one sample sound. I tuned it by ear, and that was the bass line. I didn't even think about those kinds of concepts, you know. only later to realize that it's such a wonky tuning where, you know, stuff doesn't end up right and whatever, you know?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a microtonalist, I figured out that really the only wolves for me hang out near the perfect fifth and octave, right? And, like, the perfect fifth and octave become these sort of, like, deal breakers for tuning, and they're just very, very important because of the simplicity of the just intonation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly feel like fifth is a huge key to making relatable microtonal or Xen harmonic music.
Yeah.
You just need to be able to... because otherwise you can view, like, everything in an octave as sort of... It's trying to find grip, but it can't, because it can only go back to either the lower octave or the higher one, you know? So, or, you see what I mean? So you need that kind of pillar right there, sitting there, so you can always, like, gravitate towards it, you know?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What do you think of tunings that don't have a fifth, but have something that's very much like a fifth, such as a perfect 12th, which is, you know, like a fifth plus an octave? For example, Boyle and Pierce. Would you use something like that? I mean, I know you've used Boyle and Pierce, but
I guess like I didn't even realize that. I didn't know, you know. But I guess if I were to analyze what I did there, I might have subconsciously referred to that musically. I might have, you know. My ear might have been like, oh, this is stable, I need to go there. I didn't even... That's how I approached Boyle and Pierce. I was like, it's so weird, I'm not gonna think about any theory. I'm not even gonna try to, like, see what's going on. I'm just gonna make a progression and make a beat. That's it.
yeah.
It's the only time I approach music like that, because most of the time I'm very compulsive with all the processes, you know? So that felt like some kind of freedom to just be weird with it, you know? And that's why I didn't even realize the bass line wasn't supposed to work. You know, I had a sample, it's just one note, it's not even a bass line, it's just a sustained bass note. And yeah, I don't know. But I don't care about those kinds of rules, you know, like why do you have to stick to the temperament? Why can't you, like, tune something?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the question is, are you writing the music as an academic exercise, or are you writing it to be something that people will want to listen to?
Or both.
Or somewhere in between.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're... Or both. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If it's purely academic, then I can see why people would have a reason to say, well, I want everything to stick perfectly to the tuning because adding octaves is defeating the purpose of Boyle and Pierce in the first place. But if you're writing it to be listenable and enjoyable, then there's absolutely no barrier to...
No, exactly, yeah.
Adding in whatever the hell you want, right?
It's the same for, you know, regular 12 music. The most... You know, when you want to achieve a certain thing, you just pitch bend or you just detune certain things so that they get that weird feel. So it's not uncommon to practice that, you know?
I will say that on my new album, I have a Boyle and Pierce track where all of the odd harmonics are filtered out of the timbre instead of the even ones.
Nice.
I'm interested to know what that would sound like.
So, well, that's an octave.
It's actually, like, the most basic out of all the tracks, for sure. But it also uses, like, the pseudo-octave. Like, the basic progression just sounds kind of like, actually, like... kind of like a 1 and a flat 7. But the flat 7 is way flat because of the Boyle and Pierce thing going on. But yeah.
Can you explain something for me? Sorry, I'm eating a cookie.
Ooh, yummy. I'm jealous.
So... You said that you were writing a Boyle and Pierce song, and the timbre you're using only has even harmonics.
Well, sort of.
Well, I'm trying to understand what that timbre actually is, because if it has harmonics, say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, then it really just contains all the harmonics, but it's an octave higher. Or is it that it only contains octaves that are powers of 2, like 1, 2, 4, 8, which is like a timbre built up of octaves?
Well, with some of them it's that, and then with some of them it's just octaves. So I tried to just kind of eliminate, like, partial 3 and partial 6 in general, and then sometimes I eliminated partial 9.
Okay.
But I didn't build the sounds from scratch. I went into Absinthe and took out any of the odd harmonics that I thought would be too Boyle and Piercey. So
Okay.
Okay.
And how does the result hit you, like, to your own ear right now? You know, do you feel like you've sort of achieved something more regular in a sense?
Yes, it's a very odd track because I also use the pseudo octave a bit, but the reverb is such that I can disguise it as a normal octave. So some of these tracks are just like insane and like really, really highly Xen rhythmic. But this Bull and Pierce track isn't.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back and forth between those two chords and it has a few parts where it breaks away. And I thought it was going to be too basic. And then my brother listened to it, and he just hates microtonality because I love it. He doesn't really hate it. He just thinks he does. So he listened to that, and he was like,
reason.
you know, that sounds kind of cool, but it's like out of tune, and I know that like your people might find that interesting. And I was like, oh, that's fun because I didn't think it was challenging enough. And then he listened to that and said that, and I was like, okay, well then that's fine. This is good.
Well, one thing I've learned is that in general, like, it gets challenging really quick.
Yeah.
You know, like we're so adapted to small changes because we are accustomed to pushing the boundaries of that. So a lot of stuff that is still like okay to us is already like way weird for people. You know?
Yeah.
And that's why I tend to when I make music, that's why I tend to stick to certain kind of rules. As I talked about, you know, I still want to deal with a home chord. I still want to deal with like a lot of perfect fifths and fourths, and then I am confident enough that at least a bunch of people will hear it and be like, that sounds kind of normal, you know?
Yeah, it's a question of who your audience is, right? Who are you targeting?
I'm targeting my future self. You know, I want my future self to be like, I kind of like that. You know?
Yeah, I write music for myself. I go, what is something that I will enjoy writing and enjoy listening to? And that's what motivates me making it. But oftentimes I get to the end of a track and I'll go, okay, that's fine. But is anyone actually going to want to listen to that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course, man. Yeah.
And usually I end up releasing them anyway. But
yeah, you should, man. Like, don't.
It's an interesting question. Are you writing music, especially with microtonal music? Are you writing it for yourself, or are you writing it for other people, and how are they going to view how bizarre it is, because it's already going to be pretty weird, right?
It's very interesting, like, to answer that question, because it's so dynamic, you know? Sure I write music for myself, because the core of making music for me is just there's something so free about harmony and melody, and something so, you know, even though you can see it as something physical, but if you listen to it, you sometimes get the feeling like, oh, music understands me, you know, because it flows into the spiritual for me fastly, you know. It's just a very spiritual experience. So that's why I make music. I love doing it, and I love experiencing harmony, right? But of course, you also make music for other people. So when I make microtonal music, I often think, oh, I'm going too weird, you know, oh, this is too... Because I might understand everything happening because I'm in the process. I know all the choices I've made. When I jump back into a project and start building again, I know where I was, what I did, why I feel like that is a correct jump to the other thing, etc. But that's not the experience people have. People just hear it for the first time, your whole thing.
Yeah.
You know? And that experience, you cannot tap into that because you are not at that place anymore. So that's why I try to pay attention to that. And that's why I say I make music for my future self, because my future self knows what's up, you know? My future self will tell me that song is not well balanced. I like this song, it just works, the harmony is there. Because you haven't heard it for a long time, you jump back, and then you are that listener again. You know, you are that person who hears it for the first time.
That's a good name for future song, music for my future self. What do you guys think about modulation? Because I don't know if I'm trying to think of tracks of yours that modulate in particular. Because I think well, Benjamin, you've got We Are Earth, and like when I listened to that, it was kind of like the ambient piece that I never had the balls to write. I tried to write it before, and like, you know, it's kind of like these long chords and they're really beautiful, and you start and they're kind of diatonic, and somebody like commented on this on YouTube, and then you have like these really cool like shift, and then it's a really Xen harmonic change with a familiar chord, but everything is moving so slowly you don't get that sense of here's the music, here's the music, here's the music. It's just floating. Like, were you thinking of modulating
Yes.
in that piece, or were you trying to stay in one key? Or
Well, the way I look at it is, it's either just 4 chords, and I treat every chord like the home chord.
ooh,
But it's just I don't think of it as modulating.
I love it.
I think of it as just weirdly shifting, and I'm back at home. You know.
yes, oh, that's cool.
I think that's the way I approach it. But that is actually one of the things that has drawn me to microtonal music, is the ability to shift smaller than a semitone.
Yeah.
Yes,
Because that is it can be so freaky, you know, each kind of shift. So for example, 31 has like a 38 cent shift, so that's what's happening there, right?
yeah,
You're just shifting everything 38 cents, and it's small enough to give you a weird sensation. And if you go even smaller, like sometimes when you listen to a live choir or whatever, and they naturally adjust because, you know, they shift and they try to sync, and so sometimes, you know, someone is a bit out of tune, so they subconsciously go towards that to compromise that, you know, or to establish a sense of harmony again. And those small shifts are magical to me, you know. So in 31, that's a bit huge, but still it's small enough for you to have that weird warping sensation, you know.
yeah,
And that's how I approach that. So I don't see that as modulating. I see that as just, you know, detuning or like bending, because I treat everything there as the home chord. You know, you can view the first chord as home, or you can view the last chord as home. It doesn't really matter. You know.
so they're a lot different, the first and last chord then.
Let me think. So every time it bends one time, so you're dealing with at the end, yeah, like 160 cents or so difference.
Oh, that
I
is
think.
cool.
I'd have to look at the whole overview or something. I don't know. I don't quite remember.
I want to figure out the chords in that.
Yeah, they're stacked, man. They're stacked chords. It's actually one of those tracks where I look back at it, I feel like I could have done a better job of like the melodic sense of it. I like the harmonic sense, like the way, you know, the chords shift, but I think it's a bit too zen for my own taste. So that's my future self looking back, you know.
Oh,
My future self is telling me, oh, this is a nice concept, but you can make it more clear, you know?
nice. I think I'm the opposite of you. I look at that and I'm like, ooh, it's so zen. Give me so much zen.
Yeah, it is though. It's a very like, you know, that's also for me like an important part of enjoying the music I make, because I have a tendency to go really compulsive and try to pinpoint everything and try to make the best thing possible. So it's a compulsive process, and sometimes I want to step out of that and just enjoy it. So what I often do is I look for a certain kind of thing I'm saying. So with that track, I was visualizing like an underground kind of cave. So do you guys like have a similar experience when you make music? Do you create worlds, or like what kind of experience do you generally have when you make music? Do you really get lost in it, or is it more like you're just making it and you're outside of it? Or do you sometimes completely lose yourself in the process in certain ways, you know?
Yeah, I a lot of my tracks have working titles that describe what scene I was thinking of at the time of writing it.
Yeah.
So you know, it'll be called like you know, like you were talking about underwater caves, or for me, you know, floating in outer space, or they'll have some long title that will describe what kind of scene I was trying to conjure up. And I mean, I'm not an impressionist music writer, but I like to try to give that impression in some way. So yeah, no, I totally relate to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the word impression is key here, because what we're talking about is having sensory experiences, but then internally we're kind of having these abstract impressions, and focusing on those impressions it's kind of like a lens through which you can focus on the music itself.
Yeah.
And I get the impression when I listen to particularly your music, Ben, is those impressions. I get a sense that you have this deep kind of in the moment perception of what you're listening to and what you're doing when you're making this music, but that what you're actually focusing on is this other world. And I just want to say one other thing about you were talking about how small intervals can have this kind of massive effect.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. Sometimes it's, you know, less is more. It's like, to use a visual analogy, if you're outside on a bright day and then you suddenly walk into a tunnel, it goes from bright to dark. And it's such a big jump that you can almost kind of block it out in a way.
Yeah.
But if you're outside on in a bright day and just a faint cloud passes overhead and there's just that slight perceptual shift can sometimes be really unsettling in a way that the big shift wasn't.
Yeah.
And to bring it back to the music, it's about using both kinds of those shifts. Sometimes doing something drastic to move quickly from one place to another, but sometimes just like modulating down by a quarter tone, just for the effect that has. And again, these are all different things that in the music are like sensory things that you're hearing when you're listening to music, but the impressions that they give you is that's what I'm doing quite a lot of the time when I'm listening to music, is I'm focusing on those impressions as well. But for me, they're not like visual impressions. I know a lot of people that get visual impressions when they listen to music. They see scenes, they see all kinds of things. I really don't get that.
Okay.
But I get more like moods.
I get visual stuff from Sean's music a lot. I'd actually, when I was really like into your music early on, I would purposely not look at the video to try and form an image in my head of what it was, and I was always wrong.
No, you weren't wrong. The video is, I've had that recently. Another friend of mine said that to me. Like, he didn't realise that all of my music was on YouTube, but he'd been listening to it on his phone for years.
Okay.
And then when he looked at the videos, he just thought all of them were wrong, or felt like he had been wrong. But no one is wrong. Those impressions are the part of the music that you yourself get to enjoy. That's you joining in with the music. That's the audience participating in the music by forming all these impressions. So it's important that you just turn the video off and ignore it.
I wonder, like, I get, like, when I listen to your music, Sean, like, I get really strong moods or vibes, you know? And that's also, I don't get that a lot with a lot of music, but your music, a lot of your tracks really trigger that, and they open up those worlds that I experience myself when I make music, you know? So that's why I love, like, tuning into that. And what I wonder is if I get like a specific frequency or a specific type of mood, because you know how complex they can get in your own mind, right? Those moods are so specific and you cannot put any words on them. They're just like experiences.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, did you have those specific frequencies when you were making it, or is that something that my life dictates I am going to feel, you know? Do you understand, like, the meta kind of question I'm asking here? Or do you experience the same specific types of mindsets and moods when you're making that? Because it's ingrained in the music? Or does the music have the potential to open it up in different ways for different people?
I'm not actually sure. I would suspect that it would be different for each person, because in the music there's also a lot of cultural references. You know, for example, what the style is, and these can have impressions of their own. But each person's experience with all of these things, you know, the music's kind of like a language. We're trying to express something, but it's not meaning based, it's more abstract. And again, we keep coming back to the word impression, but it's more of impressionistic, I feel, particularly with music that doesn't have lyrics in it. There's no meaning at all, even if there are some, you know, liner notes or program material or something. It doesn't really matter. The music itself can mean a lot of different things to different people. Yeah, that's all part of the fun.
Can, but you know, sometimes you kind of have that feeling that it might trigger the same thing, the same specific thing in people, even though it's so abstract and so, like, you cannot put a label on it like happy or sad, because we can do that with most music. We can all generally say, okay, this makes me happy, this makes me sad, whatever. But you have these weird spots where it opens up an experience inside your mind or spirit, for that matter, that it's eerie, you know. You cannot put words on it. It's just a specific type of mood, and I wonder if that is in the music, or if that's also different for people, you know. So then you actually come to the question, like, is music an actual direct language, or does something say a bunch of things at the same time?
I hope we can eventually answer these questions.
Or maybe not. Maybe we don't want to know, you know. Maybe it will kill it.
The mystery.
I don't think it will kill it.
I guess so.
I just wanted to give an example of like a neutral pentatonic sort of thing.
Yes.
Do you hear that? So it has like, to me, it has a really happy sound. It's almost happier than major, because major is quite bright and can almost, I mean, I can't play major on this because it's super major, but I don't know. It has like a contented happiness to it, like a warmth. And neutral chords to me are like not super consonant, but playing neutral intervals in a scale have this like, Ben and I were talking about it earlier. They have this like festive, like happy spirit sort of to them, without being too over the top in the way that major can be. So I think there's a lot of room for them to be used in that way, and I think they are used that way in a lot of like Middle Eastern traditions. Like the Rast scale or whatever has, to me at least, like a really man. I hate to use the word happy because we've been using the word happy the whole time, but happy in a contented sort of way, yeah, or almost like an adventurous sort of way.
But sometimes it's completely like counterintuitive, you know. That's why I find it hard to sometimes pinpoint emotions, because for example, the main neutral scale that you can access in 17 but also in 31. So in 17 that would be 0, 2, 4, 7, 10, 12, 14, 17, right? That's the main neutral scale in 17.
I think it's got lots of other names. That's makam bayati. Hold on.
Right, yeah. So normally if I would listen to this without a context, it might appear dark to me, or, you know, more related to minor. It might just give me a depressed or sad feel. But when you, for example, use it, you know, I like to test audio on visual. So let's take an alien invasion scene where you need to get that feel of like, you know, like it's threatening. Sometimes this type of stuff can then suddenly become like a parody of its own, you know, where you're like, oh, it just doesn't have the right reaction. So then suddenly it's not sad anymore. It's just, it doesn't, you cannot like get the right emotion out of it anymore. And then you're questioning yourself, like, what does it say actually, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why it's hard to put it in those kind of categories. But if you were to do so, I find neutral kind of stuff undecisive. It doesn't know exactly what it wants to be, you know? But it's still beautiful on its own because it's, you know, it's musical and you can build a lot of different kinds of vibes from it. But I cannot pinpoint the exact emotion from that because it's really contextual, you know? Maybe neutral just has the potential to be like either minor or major. So let's say you're just working in neutral and then you do one modulation to either major or minor and go back to neutral. Suddenly it is the opposite of that.
Yeah, if you compare it to the others, it certainly takes on the opposite characteristic. But I think if you jump into it on its own, it's something very unique. And to me, the neutrals I find much more melodic than harmonic. Like I find them very difficult to incorporate into harmony. Not that they can't be done. If you stack a neutral third on top of a super major or a sub minor chord, in 17 equal, I forget the ratios, but you end up with like fairly JI sounding chords that are really interesting.
The Mercury Tree does that in Spider Milk.
Yeah. They do a really good job of it. It's worth making the distinction, I think, as well, is that we talk a lot about neutral. A lot of people think of like neutral being one thing, but when I'm thinking about neutral, ratios of 11 to me sound very different to ratios of 13. So ratios of 11 I find lock in to JI much more nicely, but ratios of 13 I enjoy more. I'm not sure why. So like 13 on 12 is a neutral second, and 11 on 10 is also a neutral second. But they're really far apart, and on 11 on 10 is like this bright, sort of excitable sounding neutral second, whereas 13 on 12 is like a dark, brooding, very introspective sounding sort of neutral second. You know, and I think the 11th harmonic in a major chord really locks in, whereas the 13th harmonic has this instability to it where it pushes, it makes it feel less major, whereas the 11th harmonic makes it feel more major to me. Anyway. So I think the different shades of neutral, like there's not one neutral. There's lots of room there.
True. I think we come back to that point where we were talking about that 313 tuning, where you pick a subset and it has its own kind of character, right?
Yeah.
The same goes for like applying neutral even in smaller temperaments. So if you have 17, that neutral skill that we talked about, like 0, 2, 4, etc., you can do it in 31, and it's just, if you look at the deviations in sense, it's just a little bit different. But for example, that second in 31 just doesn't have that dark kind of tone that it has in 17. In 17, that skill feels really like dark, and it implies a lot of threatening sensations, whereas if you use that skill in 31, it suddenly becomes bright, and you can put it in way different contexts or in terms of emotion. Like if you have to put like sad or happy or that kind of terms on it, it would be a way different sensation than in 17, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the nuances always make huge differences, you know, and you cannot really. That's why we all agree that is kind of rude to say music is sad or happy, you know. Like,
right, giving it that blanket statement. You know, I feel like these little nuances, they always make me very interested in like trying to break the categories we've built up for ourselves. So like lately I've thought of a tuning where I'm really interested in having two kinds of what people would consider neutral thirds, so that they might sound major and minor sort of by themselves in that context, and then kind of changing it to actual major and minor thirds later, so that that orientation is really confusing. Well, I have a really cool idea for a 19-tone song where if you use Godzilla 9, you can get chords that are sub-minor and super major at the same time.
I like Godzilla. Good choice.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, I'm very interested in like making sort of new categories for chords, and in particular, I'm really excited to break out my 19-tone guitar and try chords in 19 that are both sub-minor and super major at the same time, which is something that I don't think I've heard. And if you do that in Godzilla 9 with the 1, 4, and 5 chord, there's only one note that's not diatonic in Godzilla 9.
So you're using both the super major and sub minor third at the same time in that chord? Is that what you're saying? I've been playing with that idea recently.
Yeah. Did you do them both at the same time?
There are some specific ratios that work really well as well. Like, I originally got interested by the idea because in 17 equal temperament, the sub minor third is roughly 13 on 11, and the super major third is roughly 14 on 11. And so the first thing I thought when I saw that is I was like, hold on a minute. Those should work at the same time, and it makes for so I think that's a really cool idea, so I'm interested to hear how that comes out.
You know, if you have the nature of a tuning having sub minor and super major instead of, you know, minor and major, it's way more forgiving in harmony context. I think I have that somewhere in a 17-tone track where there are a certain chords where I'm like, wait, do I have like a sub minor and a super major there?
Yeah. Well, I'm probably not the best person to comment on it because I absolutely love dominant sharp 9 chords, and my favorite scale is the diminished scale. So I'm a big fan of clashing thirds together. But
oh yeah, those are really fun.
So I think I avoid that quite a lot. To like, you know, my chords are always pretty decisive in terms of if it wants to be minor or major. You know, it's. But I do play around with shifting in progressions between major and minor a lot. You know, I like that kind of concept. But if you were to translate certain chords that you're applying in your context in 17 tone, where you have that sub minor and super major, if you translate that and try to squeeze it into 12, it just doesn't.
It doesn't sound right.
It's way more forgiving.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed is that if your harmonies are really pure, you can get away with almost more of that clash because the purity. Let me give an example. So in I can't remember, in a few tracks, I think in my latest album using the guitar, I think I tuned the G string down by 35 cents on the 17-tone guitar, so it has almost just intonation major chords, and so it's got various progressions that are using these almost just intonation major chords, and then over the top of it, I'm playing sub-minor pentatonic scale. And the 7/6 sub-minor third is just close enough in 17 equal, or it does that just close enough that you play that over the top and it almost doesn't clash at all with the major chords, because you think 7/6, 5/4, they add up. Your fundamental harmonic, or the fundamental of your chord is like roughly the 12th harmonic. Does that make any sense? Like everything connects together such that there's no clash. So you can play it in like I think sort of a bluesy way. And because the major chords are so pure, you almost don't even notice that there's a clash there. It's really interesting.
And that's the track that you had the 12-bar blues on, right?
Yeah, that one I definitely did it on, yes. Yep. And the 12-bar blues, the whole progression, all of the chords are from 34 equal.
What I find interesting in terms of clash, so most of the times it's all about the resolution, right? And what I find interesting about microtonal music in that way is, if you compare it to 12 tone, where what I love in orchestral cinematic music is you have a chord and then they build tension by having like two notes in the same octave next to each other, just stacking up, and then they release it with the next chord. You know the phenomenon I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So most of the times they do it with violins, like two buzzing semitone violins, and then they release into an open chord, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I love exploring that kind of stuff in temperaments where you have smaller distances. You know?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
you might have. I love stacking, like to see what happens when you have like a 40 cents difference in between two notes, but you just push them against each other and release them into a nice chord, because that can give huge sensations, you know, that you can never. So that then you get to that point where why not stack a sub minor and a super major? You know, if I release them in certain ways, why not? You know.
Yeah.
But in 17 it's open, right? So it's bigger than like how many? That's 140 cents, the difference between sub minor and super major.
Oh yes, yeah, 141 cents I think.
Yeah, so it's because we are so adjusted to the 100 cent semitone. It feels open enough that it's distinct enough to not be clashing in a certain kind of way.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's just a deeper kind of meta science to why it sometimes works and why it doesn't. It's always hard to approach that from a theoretic kind of aspect, because even though I think I might be onto something, normally people will correct me and be like, no, it's because of this or that, or I don't know. I just try to feel that kind of stuff out, man.
In a chord that's sub minor or super major enough, where the sub minor third is low enough and the super major third is high enough, you almost don't get the sensation that it's major or minor anymore if things get far enough apart, and you get the sensation that like it's kind of like a stacked chord of some kind with interesting properties that you can't quite find in 12 EDO, but it reminds you of like extended chords in that realm. I'd sadly have not done enough 19 EDO music. I might have only written one song in it, which is really bad because I have a 19 EDO guitar. So we'll fix that in 2020.
Well, it's important to collaborate with this sort of thing as well, because yeah, that's right. There are so few resources that collaboration is one of the greatest ways to learn, and to generate new music and new ideas.
Yeah, I think like the Xen community is in a way pretty young, and we don't have that many people if you hold it against like how the rest of the musical world is developing. So those collaborations are not only like useful, but also very fun, because you're in those stages where everything is new. Everything you do has not been done before anyway. I love that sensation.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can actually, meet up with people, and like we're doing right now. Like I never thought I would end up having conversations with the people I first were just online characters.
Yeah.
Like that kind of stuff really makes it fun to be fun to operate in this realm. And I just also love the fact that the microtonal community is so supportive, man. Like, they actually support what you're doing and support the music, and generally love the things that people are exploring, and it's a positive kind of sensation. So it adds to the sensation of making music,
community.
Yeah, we're all hungry for new sounds. We're all waiting for someone to come in, because there's all of these little niches that haven't been explored here. Like, we need we need more microtonal bluegrass. I mean, it's kind of microtonal anyway, but we need a microtonal bit of everything, yeah? And everyone's waiting for their favourite style of music to kind of have a microtonal spin on it. So, super welcoming.
That opens up something interesting. Like, let me ask you, Sean, when you make music, do you try to at least put it in a certain kind of context, or are you just, for example, do you sit down and think, I want to make it drum and bass, for example, or does it just end up that way because you gravitate towards it? Or do you want to sometimes, try to do it so that you open up that realm online for people, so that people think, oh, I want drum and bass, I'm specifically, so that you make it for them,
I mean, I write a lot of drum and bass because I enjoy drum and bass. But when I'm writing a piece of music, I don't always have an idea of where I want it to go at the beginning. I just have maybe one or two parts that kind of work by themselves, and I kind of want to flesh them out, and I can hear what could go with it. And very early on, I can get a sense of the pulse, the tempo, the tempo in particularly. Just trying to find what genre would fit into that tempo is something that just happens naturally. Doesn't have to be thought about. If something is kind of danceable, then it's probably around 120 something. I don't know. And then things like that.
There are so many areas unexplored, so there are certain genres that are not even there within the tonalities we dive into. So sometimes you wonder, at least I think about that stuff, like, should I be making 90s boom bap or something, in a microtonal way.
Occasionally I do that.
I don't want to distract too much from just where I want to go, where my mind tells me I want to go. So it's a subconscious process where I'm like, I just drift off into my own musical world, and I don't want to care about, that kind of stuff. But sometimes you do think about it because it can open up, even a lot of public if you start to dive into that kind of stuff,
Yeah. I mean, I guess to answer your question, I guess I do a bit of both. It sounds like you do the same. I do a bit of both. It's not letting the subconscious take control of the experience, take control of the process, but just integrating the subconscious into the process where you're allowing it to feed ideas into your mind, but also you being able to yourself will the kind of music that you want to hear.
And it's always a difficult kind of lane to be walking as an artist in general, because sometimes I jump outside of the music making experience and I view the music I listen to myself and then look at my own music and I'm like, whoa, it's just a whole different kind of field. And then I start to question, like, why is that? Why do I go there when I'm building, but why do I listen to other types of sounds myself? So yeah, it's just interesting to think about, I guess. But at the end, I just want to go into a free flow and I don't want to be bothered, because every time I approach music like that, think about where I want to go, what kind of tempo, what kind of types of snares. If I start to think like that, it normally doesn't even end up well, Right. Because you're forcing it in a certain kind of picture. Whereas if you do how you feel the thing should sound, it will end up in its own kind of right, I guess. As we talked about, like, there's so much music that just isn't there yet with these new kinds of tonalities. So it's interesting to think about,
I've noticed over the last couple of years that there's this whole group of what would I call it, like jazz fusion, chiptune artists, video game inspired, but also very maximalist, very clever music that people are writing, and that there's a whole group of people from that scene getting into microtonal music now. So over time, we're kind of spreading. It's nice.
I just wonder what's going to happen when certain, people that are considered geniuses or the greats of our time, what happens if you just give them 22? Give them 22,
Yeah.
Just build one track in it, just go for it, And that's just kind of stuff you don't see happening a lot. So I love it when I discover someone new who is fresh into microtonality, but has a huge kind of musical background in other types of stuff, maybe even 12 tone. They have established that kind of raw skill there, and then they just grab that tuning and go for it. And sometimes you encounter that beautiful microtonal stuff where you're like, damn,
Well, it's also interesting when music educators get into it, because like for example, Adam Neely. So you have people who are already have an audience of people who are very interested in pushing the limits on music. You see suddenly this surge in interest. It's growing. it's growing at a rate where it's going to be very interesting in the next few years. The kinds of people that are going to be doing stuff with microtonality, I'm really excited for it.
Well, even when he does stuff, I instantly tune in because I want to know what kind of sounds he's going to pull out of those tunings. When I notice like, oh, he's doing 17, I just wanted to know what it's going to sound like, because he's an established kind of jazz musician. So it's going to be like, he's going to aim for maybe a certain kind of harmonic intactness. So I just want to hear what kind of consonants he's going to draw out of those tunings. That fascinates me, And then you always, when he does something, because he's a big personality in the scene, when he does that, it's the whole market is going to be flooded by lo-fi, quarter tone shifting chords,
It was so funny how that just suddenly happened one or 2 months ago. Just suddenly, quarter tone shifting, lo-fi, exactly as you described.
Yeah.
It became a hot sound for that month.
Oh, it was good though. I liked it.
It is. Yeah. And it got a lot of people excited.
The people from the 12-tone background, they almost always approach it a certain way. So they never make the chords Zen, but they just shift it because they like that distorted, shift in chords,
But you know what? That's not too different to the approach that we're taking with 22, where the individual chords are very familiar, but we're just taking them and throwing something that sounds like a weird modulation in there. It's kind of like that.
Well, it makes it much more approachable as well. I was just saying, it makes it like for people who've never been exposed to microtonality, only using one aspect of it, so only using the modulation aspect of it, but not touching weird chords. It makes it much more accessible, I think, and much easier for people to get into, rather than throwing a whole, if you threw 23 equal temperament at someone and said, make something with this. They're going to have no idea where to start because they're not going to have the resources.
It's not just that people are used to having like 12-tone chords and then... What I'm pointing at is the reason why people gravitate towards that and they rather shift the chords weirdly than make the chords extended in tonality is because 12-tone implies simple ratio. So 12-tone is just one of the most strong harmonic sensations out there, So I think that that might be why microtonality hasn't blown up to the degree it could have done, is because we're still dealing with the fact that, harmonic difficulty is something you often have to learn, or you just have to really get into that sound, right? And I'm not saying like some tunings are, they are not, how do you say it, simple in a sense or ratio wise or how they relate to the harmonic series. It's just like the sensations, and the sensations are something you really have to get into. So you rather shift a chord in a certain way than have that chord be more unstable to your ears, right? Because a chord lasts a certain amount of time. A shift happens. A shift is a moment. A chord is something you need to hang on, right?
Yeah.
In your perception. So that's why I think people just, shift the chord more than they actually dive into deeper chord structures.
And I hope they stick with this craft for long enough that they then go in and investigate the really Zen sounding chords rather than just the familiar chords in weird places. And I think, a lot of people will.
There's this kind of unspoken consensus that microtonality equals Zen harmonic and that Zen harmonic equals weird, There is that kind of...
Or out of tune.
Yeah, or out of tune. And that is most of the time because either it is out of tune or it's unfamiliar.
Yeah.
That's the thing, because a lot of people that make microtonal music, they might not even have a musical background at all. They just figured, I want to do this. So you're not going to end up with the most, relatable type of sounds. No one is, how do you say that? Everyone is a slave to that. You have to build up experience. So the reason why I'm so convinced of microtonality and Zen harmonic music is because I've heard the stuff where I'm like, this just works. Because I went deep enough into like finding those gems where I found them and I was like, damn, it does work. And this is the type of stuff that if you show that to people, they will respond well to it. They're gonna think, I'm not familiar with the tonality, but it feels like a completely open musical kind of experience. There's that border. You cannot specifically say where that border is, but once you cross it, it goes into that range where it's just not acceptable for you to listen to it. You just don't enjoy it anymore because it's too much or too dissonant or too jarring, right? But if it's not past that, you might actually enjoy it. And I think for me, that is when music can stack up a lot of dissonance. I don't care, but it just has to equally resolve into its counterpart. So that means a completely like non-jarring kind of musical chord or whatever, right? So that's kind of how it works for me. If something builds up huge dissonant, it has to have the exact opposite doing the resolution, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, or you could reverse it if you're a weirdo. I mean, I love the idea of the destinationally oriented, like, consonance and dissonance in where things go. I like that opposing discordance, like resolving into discordance. Seems like a pretty cool option to me.
Okay, yeah, sure, but still you're dealing with you're still dealing with that, the fact that you have that consonance or that open sensation or that non-jarring effect in there. You're still like utilizing that so that you keep the music in a certain realm. Sometimes you hear microtonal or Xen harmonic music where it's just too much.
What's a good example of something that's too much?
I don't want to, put people out there, but so I'm picking something I made myself, and that is Seeps.
Okay.
Do you know the track in 22 tone Seeps that I made like 9 months ago, if I'm correct? What's happening there? Like there's some nice stuff going on there, but the piano chords, they're too wobbly, because I'm going for like 12 tone chords, but I'm doing it in 22, and sometimes 22 gets way wobbly and it just doesn't work. 22 is weird in that sense because certain kinds of things you go for, they just end up completely right, and sometimes the nuance changes if it's right or not. And in this case, like, I look back at it and I'm like, no, the chords are too much. It's too jarring for me.
Definitely not too jarring for me.
Could I add to what you were saying earlier about like everything being close to a JI ratio? That my opinion is that there's no interval, there's no dyad that isn't close to at least one useful simple JI ratio, like close enough that is usable as that. Because your hearing isn't infinitely granular. There's a resolution to it, and the resolution isn't even amazing. Like most people can't distinguish things that are a couple of cents away from each other, or like, unless you listen to beating and stuff. But I'm saying in a practical snenario, you're not going to be able to tell if they're a few cents away.
Right.
So
if you were like singing it.
Yeah. So I like to, when I've got an equal temperament, especially 17 equal temperament or whatever, you can nail down every single interval in it to a fairly simple JI ratio, and it will be within a couple of cents of that. So there's always opportunity to then build chords out of those and represent them as JI and say that it's essentially equivalent to JI, even though I'm using things that are totally irrational. So I just say, I think I agree with your earlier point, Benjamin, that any note you pick and any chord you build is going to be close to something in just intonation. There's no such thing as an inherently badly tuned chord. Do you know what I mean? And
that is, I think, most of the times for me, why certain tunings just work while they might not look good on paper. Is maybe the individual intervals are not syncing that well, but how they relate to each other in some kind of deep way just works, and then you get that aura of the tuning where you're like, I like that. But generally, if an aura, even though someone who composes a track, even though everything is between quotes correct harmonically, it might have that overall jarring sensation where I'm like, don't like it,
Have you ever listened to Andrew Heathwaite's album New Beams? Any of you?
I'm pretty sure I've heard the whole thing, but it was quite a few years ago.
The featured track on that has a really potent dissonance that reminds me of a quarter tone, but it's not. The track is called Spun in 37 EDO. And just like, it's like a really simple, like almost 1 or 2 bar chord cycle that comes around to this chord that kind of sounds like, I'm trying to like think about it in my head, and I can't quite parse it out, but there's some very dissonant rub that's not a potent quarter tone there that I think would be... I'd be curious to see if you would think that would be too jarring, because I kind of like relish that as like a bitter flavor that's really mysterious. And And it's almost like 12 tone equal temperament can't be... It's almost like it can't be dissonant anymore, you know, to me. Now that we have wolves, and now that we have, like, you know, quarter tone dissonance, you know... You know, that's so much more of a rub than this is, and even this.
I quite enjoy like dissonances in terms of like you know how like beating and that kind of stuff. I enjoy that more than compositional dissonance. And what I mean by that is, for example, I won't listen to atonal music. You know, it's just when compositionally I don't, you know, can't vibe with it. That is more jarring to me most of the time than acoustic things happening. You know, I can listen to a lot of jarring stuff where you have, you know, sometimes I find it beautiful when you have two notes that might be 30 cents apart, but they're buzzing against each other, and it creates this weird kind of acoustic phenomenon where it just it's completely jarring. It creates all kinds of artifacts. So I enjoy that kind of stuff. That I can listen to that. I cannot listen to something where I feel like compositionally it's dissonant, you know?
Like as a throwback to Gamelan again, bring us full circle. How you know, something like gamelan beating that's like the main affair. That's one of the main significant aspects of the way that they're tuned. Is rather than trying to tune to pure JI ratios or to a scale that has particular melodic qualities, they're tuned so that the beating has particular interesting, like almost like the tuning is based in rhythm. Which is something that's totally unfamiliar to like most other styles of music. I think it's really interesting. And you can do interesting stuff like that with something like 31 or 34, where you can use those little intervals and let them rub up against each other and introduce beating into the chords. That's just, it's a totally new experience. I really like it.
Make me understand the darkness that's residing here in me. Make me understand your devil, so the light is so I see. Make me understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near. Understand the darkness that is falling over me. Show me that you are the light that's always near.
So I think maybe we can do a little bit of wrap up. There is one question I wanted to ask both of you guys, Benjamin and Declan. I wanted to ask you how. Yeah. Well, where is the Xen Garden, and who is Professor or Dr. Xen Arman?
Dr. Xen Harmon is like the Professor Oak of microtonal music, man.
We had a discussion where we were labeling different tunings as different equal divisions of the octave as different Pokemons. And so we were giving them like which ones were the starter Pokemon and.
Oh my god, that's such a good analogy.
Do you have the list here?
No, but to be fair, like let me go a bit serious, man. I don't know. It's just like a character I invented. You know, it's part of the. When I make, as I talked about earlier, I like to have visuals when I make music. So I figured there needs to be some kind of archaeologist type person that just dives deep into the you know, all the deeper aspects of why music works and why it doesn't. And it's just a reflection also of like how deep people tend to dive into the theoretic aspects of microtonal music. That to me was in the beginning like shocking, like whoa, people go so deep theoretically, and I was just sitting there like I just want to create vibes, you know. So I guess Dr. Xen Arman is in that sense the whole microtonal community if it were to be one being, you know.
Can I read out some of our things? Are you gonna hate me for reading these out? These are hilarious. So we've got the starter Pokemon are 19 Edo, 22 Edo, and 24 Edo. That's what we decided. And so 19 is Bulbasaur, 22 is Charmander, 24 is Squirtle.
Oh my god, that's so perfect.
For some reason we decided that Bolan Pierce was Magikarp because it doesn't get enough love. And 13 is Mr. Mime.
Everybody loves Bolan Pierce. Bolan Pierce is the only non-octave tuning that gets any love.
That is true, yeah.
What is the actual tuning that gets nothing? I think Magikarp would be something like 2 EDO. No one would ever use it because it evolves into something better.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point, yeah.
These are good, though.
I like that. That's a better analogy.
I love it. Like the Pokemon tunings idea. There should be a whole album about that.
Was there a part of that question beyond the Pokemon thing? You said something about the Xen Garden. I don't remember what the question was.
How did you decide to do the Xen Garden together?
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of my favorite tracks, honestly, from like both of you. There's just such a sense of like pervasive like microtonality and like slight gloom about it that vibes really well with the tempo.
Yeah,
it's very nice.
I wanted to say we both came to the realization that 17 is more magical than we both have thought for a long time. You know.
Yeah.
And we've already been like talking a bit because you encounter one another if you're in that field of music because there's not that much out there. So you start talking to everyone in the scene, and we've been talking about a lot of stuff, and we were specifically talking a lot about neutral intervals and and why we love certain kind of tunings. And then at some point I just think we naturally went for it, and 17 seemed logical because in that time frame we both got really convinced of its potential, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I got convinced enough that I bought a guitar, so I'm stuck now. I think you originally wrote that chord progression. I think it was just the chord progression. You sent it to me and said, here's something interesting. Do you want to collaborate on this? And so then I wrote some little guitar bits and sent those to you. And then they were rubbish. They were no good at all. And so then you chopped them up and we worked around that tonality for a bit, and I think you wrote lyrics and sung over it. And so it was mostly Benjamin's effort. He produced most of it, but I played a lot of the guitar, like the chords, and there's like a solo that I wrote and stuff. And I would sort of write those, like perform and write those and keep them quite dry and send them to him and let him have creative freedom as to how he fit them in the track.
Yeah, but you should give yourself more credit because this track was not only like producing, it was also the way we thought about every process. You know, we were constantly thinking about like how to make the sound, you know, how to orchestrate the sound, and we went deep into like how can we make something that doesn't even have minor and major, how can we make it sound the least jarring. You know, we were thinking about those concepts in deep kind of way. So I think that builds a track more than just like producing it, you know. we went really deep into those kinds of aspects.
Yeah, I just think it was an important thing to mention for it because it's, in terms of microtonal collaboration, I think even more so than a regular collaboration, there's a lot of room for clashing of ideas. So to have one person at the helm and the other person sort of taking over one specific aspect of it.
Yeah.
I think it flowed very naturally. It's like I was happy to surrender everything I'd written, knowing full well that they'd be implemented in a way that we'd both be happy with. You know, I wasn't writing the song, but I was writing specific aspects of the song to help shape it. I think it turned out really nice.
Yeah, I like it as well. Like, I think this collaboration in general worked, and that was my idea when we dove into it as well. Like, it's just going to work, is because we both, first of all, we're in this weird kind of section of music, so we're not going to be overly critical. We just want to experience new stuff. And at the end, I knew you would be the kind of person that would be, you know, would be okay with like putting it out there, and you know, just the end result didn't really matter. It's all about the fun of the process and what kind of nice tonalities we can conjure, you know. So I knew that kind of collab is just bound to like have a nice flow, you know.
And I try not to set my expectations too high because I'm not a very good guitarist. I'm still like quite new to guitar, and I'm with 17-tone guitar. I really hadn't had it for very long at the time, so I really didn't know what I was doing at all. So the fact that it turned out like it did makes me really, really happy with it, because it could have gone bad, but we managed to pull through. I think it could have gone really bad if we had have stuck with the original stuff I recorded, for sure.
It was okay, man. Like, don't downgrade yourself, man. But yeah, it was just a learning curve for just the tuning itself for both of us. You know, we just wanted to have experience in it because we got convinced of its potential and that it gets overlooked because of the absence of the regular thirds and stuff. And we figured, like, wait, but why does it just sound melodically coherent? So why can't it be the same harmonically? We just have to find the way of approaching it and find the way of presenting it, you know? So that's why we also sat down, like, okay, we're going to keep the chords static. We're not going to, you know, we're just going to have a main progression, and we can like build on that, but that has to stay intact and stay there so that you can always, as a listener, go back to that core, you know?
Yeah. I think it's worth adding, just for everyone, like anyone who's listening, who's interested in doing a collaboration, that in microtonal music, it's such a fantastic learning experience. Like, I think you can probably agree, we both learnt so much from doing it. So much more than like producing a track on your own, because you get exposed to ideas that you just wouldn't think of if you have someone else there. And that's especially important when you're working with systems that are just unfamiliar and have so much uncharted territory, that everyone's going to take a different path, and you can learn so much from that paths that other people choose to take. I think it's incredibly useful and a lot of fun to do. So I recommend it to everyone.
It's a direct resource, you know. Normally when you dive into microtonal music and you're by yourself, you just have infinite amounts of data online and you just get lost in this weird kind of matrix. But here you're sitting with someone with the same interest, and you're, you know, talking about like, yo, how does this note make you feel, and how does this relationship to that make you feel, and do you experience the same here, or should we maybe try to approach it like this? And flowing like that just ups your level, your individual level, way up, because you're having direct feedback. And I love the fact that, you know, I want people to always feel comfortable saying like, I don't like that, or that's dissonant, or just have those raw kind of outbursts, because that's always what motivates me to, you know, it can really break you and make you think, oh shit, I'm going to give up on the whole track. And sometimes that happens. But at the end, you know, a couple of days later, you go back to your DAW and you're like, okay, I need to become better. You know, I need to upgrade myself. So it always motivates on a deeper level than just having that, you know, the internet stare at you in a way. This is just like a raw kind of experience, you know? So yeah, it was fun, man. It was fun to sit down and make some Xen harmonic music with you, man.
Yeah. You too. Cheers.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show. All of you, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us on. It's a big honor, and I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, thanks guys. It's been great.
Okay, everyone. Well, we might have music almost constantly going throughout the whole episode.
Fantastic. Okay, do whatever you want.
Cool. All right, awesome.
Really nice talking to all of you.
You guys have a good one.
Take it
Yeah,
easy,
man.
guys.
Nice.
Fantastic talking to you.
Peace, man. See you later.
See you out there.
Yo.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Now and Zen. We really appreciate you tuning in. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Libsyn, and YouTube, as well as email, Facebook, and Twitter on the social media end of things. Be sure to listen to Xotla's most recent album, Microtonal Funk and Blues Volume 1, as well as Benyamind's music and Sevish's music. Everyone on this episode has made a lot of listenable music and a lot of different tunings. We try to release 2 episodes a month, usually one on the 12th, and then the other near the end of the month. In February, we have 3 episodes prepared though. Get ready for Paul Ehrlich on one, and Robert Lopez Hanshaw on the other. If you like this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes so that people know what they are getting into. Pretty please? Also, if you like voting on stuff like the future of the show, and or want to have your opinions considered in great detail, be sure to become a patron of the show on patreon.com. I think it would be cool if this podcast became a sort of billboard for upcoming microtonal events. Anyway, we have quite a few on the way, which I'll proceed to explain below. First event. If you're in the Pittsburgh area, and or if you can get to Pittsburgh, check out the Beyond Microtonal Music Festival, co-presented with the Andy Warhol Museum from February 28th to March 1st. This event is created by Dr. Matthew Rosenblum and features ensembles such as the Ray Calais Duo, the Micro Ensemble from Finland, the Fret X Guitar Duo, and the Del Sol String Quartet. Wow. I've provided a link in the description so that you can check it out. There's lots of music by well-known and or living composers. Sounds exciting. Second event. For our second event, we have our fellow microtonalist, Juhani Vesikala, from the Czech Republic to talk to us about Microtonal Prague 2020.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Juhani Vesikala, and I wanted to let you know about Microfest Prague 2020. This festival takes place in the Czech Republic in Prague from April 23rd till 25th. At this 3-day festival, we feature many presentations and concerts that aim to enrich worldwide dialogue about microtonal music. This is something unique and big because microtonal activity has been scarce in Czechia after Alois Hába's Microtonal Institution in Prague ended. This festival assumes an international scale with the format of Microfest, which I have previously used in Helsinki, Finland, to organize a similar festival.
Would you be able to tell us about the events and the people behind them?
Yes, sure. There will be 2 days of lectures and lots of microtonal works played on each evening from Thursday to Saturday. Our main lecturers include Mark Sabat, Robert Hasegawa, and Klaus Lang. Lecturers and performing musicians also include Margaret Mayhoff-Eliška, Erik Tresho, Linnea Sundfeld-Kasseli, Daniel Costello, Christian Klinkenberg, Juuso Kuntu, Edward Powell, Petr Pařízek, Chuhei Iwasaki, Ivan Borash, Eva Opliszczylowa, Donald Bausted, Stephen Altoft, and as our visiting ensemble from Austria, the Schallfeld Ensemble with a quartet setup. The composers featured include Alois Hába, Klaus Lang, Mark Sabat, Xue Han, Hökja Kim, Eleni Ralli, Peter Körsegi, Antonis Rouvelas, Jonas Marti, Pavel Shabatsky, Luis Aguirre, Michael Mikulka, Milan Guščar, Alisa Aska, Mike Capello, Olga Krashenko, Rusbeh Rafi, and me.
That sounds awesome!
Yes, thank you. Thanks again for listening, and if you would like to get in touch with Microfest Prague, you can send us an email at microintervalinstitute@gmail.com. We still have some options for accommodation during the festival at reasonable prices. You can also visit our website at microintervalinstitute.wordpress.com, where you can take a look at the full festival program. We hope to see you in Prague in April.
Fun and educational. Third event. Of course, UN12 2020, the Xen Harmonic Convergence, is around the corner. This event takes place at the World Fellowship in New Hampshire in July. Having been to 3 UN12 events myself, I can say that it feels more like a wilderness retreat than a conference, which is a unique vibe for one of these events. This year at UN12, we have Mark Johnson, an essential music director, facilitator, and singer in Toby Twining's Chrysalid Requiem, as the headlining clinician for this event. An extremely exciting opportunity to get microtonal music sung by people who have the tools to bring it to life with the right intonation. Please check out the link in the description for more info, and fill out an intent to participate form if this event seems interesting to you, found also at the link. That's all the announcements. By the way, we still have that Patreon, and it's still vital for our success. Please make a monthly donation if you can. Your generous donations go towards helping pay our editors, paying the fees to host more episodes online, bringing in special guests, and allowing time for better quality of content. We also have additional conversations and bonus content for our top patrons only, though we want to continue to make the majority of our show free and accessible to everybody. Thank you for all you do as listeners and supporters of the show. This episode wouldn't be possible without the generosity of our patrons, our Xen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Xen Harmonic gods, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Tina Harmon Carteau, and the Brass Whisperer. We appreciate you listening, and catch you next time on Now in Xen.